I was always glad to see the old Majah, Honore Jaxon. He was no crackpot. He had a job as a news hawk down the street and as a furnace man in his apartment building. He was a colorful man, and he'd talk you blue in the face, and it was the sensible talk of an intelligent man, too. Even at 90, he was a man who'd command attention anywhere. He had dignity without being at all stuffy about it. Above all, the old Major talked the language of a highly cultured gentleman. He haunted auction sales, especially those that dealt in old books at reduced prices. He'd come in with a good length of rope. When books were being sold that he wanted, he'd get up and shout in that big, true, booming voice of his, "I'll take those." And the auctioneer would say, "Okay, Mr. Jackson, your credit's always good here." The auction men all knew the old Major. They likely knew he had about 8,000 books already. He'd tie up his latest purchases with that piece of rope he brought along, sling them over his shoulder, and march off. He lived in a basement down 32nd Street. The only way in was through a trap door in the sidewalk and by climbing a 20-foot iron ladder. He'd lower his books and supplies all by ropes and store it all in that basement apartment of his. We never knew just what he was saving those thousands of books for till near the end. Why did he buy? It all came out later, and what a story it made. An active supporter of labor, the Major was a champion of the underdog all his life. An idealist, he was always full of what Mr. Roosevelt called social justice, talking about his sympathies for labor. He was involved in the Haymarket affairs, where the police attacked those seeking the 8-hour day. He helped defend them and was the editor of their labor press. He showed me letters to prove to me he'd known some pretty big and some pretty tough people in Chicago, round about 1900 to 1910. Worked with Lucy Parsons, wife of Albert Parsons, the Confederate officer who was executed, along with 4 others. He even met Jose Marti when Marti met with Lucy Parsons. You know, Honore, he was a big, wobbly international workers of the world, you know. A big labor agitator, a crusader. He was with Emma Goldman, socialist candidate Eugene Debs. He helped start the IWW with Bill Haywood, Big Bill of the Western Federation of Miners. Bill would lead the strike that almost broke the back of the state of Utah. He also had affairs with Helen Gurley Flynn, the old rebel girl, and he supported Joe Hill, who wrote that song and was later shot by a firing squad. Joe Hill's line was, "I never died, don't mourn, organize." Honore also supported the Mexican Revolution, and he was a champion of the Indians. I knew he was old enough to have seen plenty of them as a young fella, for he often talked of them as if he was one of them. He never talked specifically of helping the Métis leader Louis Riel up there in Western Canada nearly 70 years ago. That all came out later, after he was gone. With the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Major supported the unemployed workers marching on Washington. Living in the Bronx, he saw the plight of the down and out, the men and women who'd become hobos, always on the move, looking for 3 square a day and a decent flop. With the entry of the United States into the Second World War, he sought to protect the Hudson River from Nazi U-boats. When the 3 allies, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met at Yalta, peace was possible. With Roosevelt's death, the new U.S. President, Harry S. Truman, hurriedly dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima. The war had been an absolute horror. People everywhere had only one desire: peace. In 1947, the fledgling United Nations, representing all the people of the world, issued its United Nations Charter banning aggressive conflict. The world was more at peace at that moment than it had been for the last 10 years. It was a crucial time, a time when the world could have stepped back and looked after the vast human needs that had been so brutally exposed by the war. It was not to be. The vision of peace was but an illusion. Instead of the world's war departments being turned into ministries of defense, instead of the promised years of peace, instead of mutual trust and confidence, the United States and its State Department launched a Cold War, dividing the world into two warring camps, communist and capitalist. Internally, in the United States, hysteria was in the air. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, launched an all-out assault on progressive forces. Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee launched witch hunts that would investigate thousands of people for communist or socialist affiliation. This was the era when, for the first time in history, television cameras were present for congressional hearings. America watched as the junior congressman from California, Richard Nixon, destroyed Alger Hiss, a former State Department official and one of the architects of the Yalta Peace Plan, which recognized the tripartite nature of the peace agreement between the Allied forces. America was at war with peace. Anyway, life wasn't being too bad to him. He had his books and his archives, and he'd often stand Abby or one of the other beaux to a cup of joe. The neighborhood was always lively. This time of year, just 3 blocks down, Macy's brought out their Christmas displays, pulling in the crowds with that jolly old elf, Santa Claus. Ironically, for all the old elves on the bum, the theater down the street was playing the movie Miracle on 34th Street. Things fell apart on December the 12th, 1951. On that morning, I remember Wall Street Abbey come rushing in, and he says, "Harry, hurry up and come on over. They're throwing the old Major out of the place he lives, and you ought to see what they had to throw out with him." Well, I went over there fast, and honest, it was the doggonedest spectacle you ever did see. Evicted! Here was the old Major sitting in the middle of a pile of crates and cartons and bundles of newspapers and books. There was a ton of it. It was his library and archives. The owner of the building claimed he was too feeble to do the furnace work, but I'll bet it was the old Major's library that really scared the officials. As a newsman, I saw the Major out there in the snow as a really big injustice. I made it a hot news angle. All the papers covered it and sent down photographers, gave 'em a front page spread on the Mirror, and even the Times gave 'em some. It was a real big news story for a day. Now, he had no place he wanted to go, and he was pretty badly shaken up by being thrown out, or rather thrown up, along with his ton of libraries. We got a truck, and the beaux saved some of those boxes of books. So the upshot of it all was I invited him to move in with us, and he did, into the shabby old Bowery News office. He was well looked after by Boxcar Betty and Bozo, the Crown Prince of the Hobos, who once studied for the ministry in New England. They looked after him, keeping the big pot-belly stove filled with wood, and Betty fed him lots of good soup and meat. Pretty soon the Major got his big booming voice back and told us about his adventures with the government of Saskatchewan back in 1885, leading with the indigenous Métis leader Louis Riel. Both of them was tried for treason. Riel was hanged, and Honore, because he was a white man, was sent to an asylum. And that's from which he escaped to the United States and began his life as a revolutionary. Well, one bitter cold day he got well enough to go out. He said he wanted to go out and sort his stuff. I said, "It's too cold, Harry." He said, Harry, I gotta do that. That isn't just junk. I've been saving it as a library and archive for the Indians and the Métis out in the Northwest. I owe them that much. They gave me the name, Honore Jaxon. Well, he went out and he stayed all day. Around 6 I went to see where he was. He had ticketed him, but by golly, the police came along and picked him up, and they took him to Bellevue Hospital. When we went to visit him and he asked us to bust him out. And I said, "Well, I don't mind telling you, my eyes filled. I don't think you can make it, Major." "I can try, Harry. I want to take my evidence to the Northwest. I can prove Riel was innocent of treason. He needs to be exonerated." The old Major fixed his eyes on me and said quietly with resignation, "Yeah, Harry, if you don't help me get out of here, this is the end. I know I'll never come out of this hospital." So I agreed, and the hobos and I left to make plans. But we also had to deal with his papers. Scavengers began to pick at the piles and the books and other mementos of his life. His landlord some sold to a mysterious paper dealer, and the rest were all destroyed, picked by sanitation, dumped on a barge and sent out to Garbage Island. Well, Christmas Eve we got a car. Bozo dressed as Santa, and we went up to get the old Major. But he was gone. After searching through the holidays, we finally found out he'd been transferred to the infamous psych ward in Bellevue Hospital on 30th Street. We had all known stories of the psych ward. It's where the ice-pick lobotomies were regularly performed to correct antisocial behavior of leftists, communists, homosexuals, musicians, and actors, such as Fanny Farmer or Charlie Bird. When we got to the ward, we saw him sitting there in a big bare room with cots in it. A number of men were just sitting there. One looked as he'd just been beaten up. They all had empty stares. The Major mumbled at us, and I don't even know whether he knew us. That was the last we saw of him. He died there on January 10th, 1952. I took to his story. I wanted to tell the world who this fellow was, and he left a lot of interesting stuff with us. So for one thing, he'd written a people's history of the Northwest, and even worked on further. So Honore Jaxon was a true hero, and his Voice of the People newspaper was famous across the Northwest back in the 1880s. So we have to respect Honore, respect his memory and what he was after. So I'm calling on people to help us develop the Louis Riel Library and Archive under the auspices of William Henry Jackson, better known as Honore Jaxon, the willfully forgotten voice of the people.